Chapter 3. Ambrose Merrick always asserted that he had written 12 books concerning his visit to the Werne. These books, he said, formed a great prose romance, intermingled with certain songs, mysteries, episodes, and parables. He has been heard to declare that he must shortly set about the revision of the manuscript and prepare this magnum opus for the press. He even quoted titles of some of the books on occasions. There were the Sylvia in Sylva, the Mysterium Calicis, the Hypnerotomachia, the Nuptiae Mysticae, the Mons Magorum, the Nox Illuminans, the Cantus Planus, and one or two others that have vanished from all record. It is, however, very doubtful whether the great romance ever existed in so tangible a form as manuscript. It is, with more probability, conjectured to have been the reflection of a glowing dream that was always shining vaguely in Ambrose's mind, which he hoped, perhaps, to reduce to a corporal shape at some indefinite opportunity. He felt, it is believed, that the theme must be treated more than worthily, with a rare and curious eloquence, and he wished for a time when he should feel within him fit force and inspiration for the carrying out of this great design. As it is, in place of complete books, there are only notes and fragments, and of these all possible advantage must be taken. Unfortunately, or fortunately, it is hard to say which, these jottings and memoranda are expressed in such a manner that the meaning is often excursively obscure, as was evident when they were mischievously submitted to the judgment of a well-known authority in literary questions, the famous author of "Get on, and be quick about it." This gentleman wrote that there was capital stuff in the manuscript. All that it wants, he said, is a little arrangement and a liberal use of the blue pencil. With some telling illustrations, I think it would do well as a Christmas book for young children. Why not, indeed? Gulliver's Travels, by the genial, kindly Dean of St. Patrick's, is to be found on every well-regulated nursery bookshelf, and Ambrose's notes do certainly suggest the atmosphere of a fairy tale. So far as this famous visit can be regarded from the common outlook, it seems to have been a very pleasant one. The old house was just the same as he recollected it. No alterations had been made without or within. The two sides of an unfinished quadrangle in grave grey stone still fronted to west and south, looking across the broad terraced lawn, the sunken lane, and the marshy land, across the winding brook and the wooded hills, glancing on one side towards Wentwood, the wilderness of leaves, and on the other to the great wall of Minith Main. The stone mullions and transoms were still there in the windows. No attempt had been made to reform the diamond quarries into plate-glass panes. It was old tinged glass, full of whorls and flaws and inequalities, and it shed a dim, soft light on the old furniture and the old pictures, both dating for the most part to the middle of the 18th century. As chance visitors had said, if one wanted to live in an old curiosity shop, one had better do so at once. Those sensible people would prefer real chairs and tables, and windows that one could see through. These people were still mid-Victorians in those days. Now their houses are furnished throughout in bad imitations of 18th century furniture, known to the owners under the comprehensive name of Chippendale. It does not matter. There are many other subjects left for them to talk balderdash about: books, pictures, music, religion. Imbecility, ignorance, impudence will never lack their due pasture, and for some good but obscure reason, the imbeciles and scoundrels always seem to get off scot-free. Wilson and Lockhart, for example, are still respected names. Yes, it was all the same. There was a little book with a curious binding in stamped gold still on a side table, just as he remembered it. And while he admired this reverence, his cousin, Mr. Vaughan, came in, cordial but evidently nervous. He was a short, thick old man with a square white beard, at which he tugged in moments of excitement, and there was a slight stammer in his voice as he made Ambrose welcome to his old home. "You will want to come permanently, I suppose, before long," he said, "We shall be sorry to leave. I admired your father. I have tried to keep everything as it was in his day." "You have been wonderfully good," said Ambrose. He pointed to the book. "I remember that book, just in that place when I was a little boy." It was evident that Ambrose was not a loud boy. His voice was low, and he did not shout all the evening. Sylvia Vaughan, a dark girl, appeared just before dinner, and afterwards they sat out on the lawn. Mr. Vaughan was pleased to find that Ambrose smoked. He always said that it was one of the greatest proofs of the insensate folly of all schoolmasters that they prohibited tobacco, since a mild sedative was evidently the very thing that the average schoolboy wanted. "Wild hearts must be hocused for the safety of the public," he said. "Schoolboys are wild hearts. Therefore they should be hocused. Conclusum est in barbara." He was ready to prove his minor premise by innumerable instances. One would have thought that he had specialized in schoolboys all his days. In reality, all these remarks were generalizations from a noisy young nephew who had stayed with the Vaughans many years before. But Ambrose was quiet and talked sense. He had some information about the existence of the pointed arch in Ireland, in churches that were certainly of the 11th century, and possibly of the 10th. Mr. Vaughan was most interested. He said that he could not quite agree with the conclusion of Ambrose's father that the existence of these arches showed that Gothic architecture, properly so called, was of Celtic origin. Still, the point was highly important. And then they talked about rhyme. Was it brought into Europe from the East or not? Ambrose ventured to think that it was an independent growth. He quoted the Easter sequence, Victimae Paschae, as an instance of rhyme in a very rudimentary state. Then back to Celtum. What was the deduction to be drawn from those curious references to the introduction of the chalice in the Percival and in the Lower Brack? How far were certain features of the Celtic Church and of Celtic ornament to be set down to Egyptian influence? The night was so calm and windless that when a servant brought out a 2-branched silver candlestick and set it on the little table beside them, the flame rose clear and unflickering. "God send us the light of heaven," said Mr. Vaughan when the candles were brought, and Ambrose remembered that the use of this ejaculation was a custom that George Herbert's country parson liked very well. The faint glow shone about Sylvia's face. It was as if a hidden glory flowed from her as she sat smiling, well pleased that her father had found at last someone to talk to. On the one side was her dark beauty, her hair drawn down from her forehead over her ears, in a style that was then, though, uncouth, unfashionable, and hideous. And on the other was the shadowy valley of the Soar, whence the fragrance of the meadow-sweet ascended with the fragrance of the wood, whence at intervals rose the lonely piping of some bird. Soft from afar came the whirring note of the farm-owl. He was deep in the bracken on that high vague hill towards the south, and without ceasing they heard the murmur of the brook. Mr. Vaughan was quite overjoyed. His few neighbours thought him a very queer old man who was always reading old books, a vice from which they were singularly free. He, on his side, thought them noodles and boobies, and perhaps there was a good deal to be said for both opinions. But he often longed for someone with whom he could talk about the many outlandish subjects which interested him, and Ambrose was more than satisfactory. But how long could he go on like this? Would he not begin to expatiate presently on his achievements at the games? Horbury had laid stress on Ambrose's athletic abilities. He would certainly show how to meet Bogler's bowling. Probably the fit would take him quite suddenly, and he would begin to shout and rush about. Or perhaps he would illustrate his theory of drop-kicking, with the little table serving instead of the ball. But Ambrose went on smoking quite placidly. He was speaking with some enthusiasm of the beauty of Old French, and maintaining that the modern language, in spite of its swift and exquisite charm, had lost a great deal by having no equivalent to the English Bible. In fact, he said, at times I almost feel as if there were something to be said for the English Reformation. Not much, of course. Suppose that in every deceased leper a surgeon could dissect out a beautiful jewel. There would be something to be said for leprosy. Mr. Vaughan grinned with delight. Lupton must be a wonderful school, he said. You went in a lot for games, Horbury tells me. He wanted to know the worst. His cousin looked gravely at him. He could not conceive that such a sensible old man would take the slightest interest in the school games, so he answered indirectly. As I was coming along in the train today, I passed a field with a lot of goats in it. A good many of them were quite young. I assure you, sir, I never saw anything quite so fantastic or quite so jolly as the sport these kids were having, leaping yards into the air to clear a small stream about a foot wide, stopping dead in the middle of a run because there was an oyster shell or a bit of glass in the way, butting at each other with such solemnity, such an evident appreciation of the rules, that it made me roar with laughter. Yes, said old Mr. Vaughan. What then? Well, I've seen a half-dozen dirty little boys having a splendid time with the lamp-post and 2 jackets as wickets, and 2 sticks and a big bundle of paper as bat and ball in the back streets of Lupton. Quite so. Mr. Vaughan's pipe gurgled with enjoyment. Proceed. And farm labourers in a good old-fashioned skittle alley with lots of good beer. They enjoy themselves too. But if you were to paint the kids with coloured stripes, or made rules about the weight of the paper ball, or insisted on all farm labourers up to the age of 80 playing skittles twice a day, then I think the whole thing would become a beastly nuisance. How the farm labourers especially would hate it, if the parson brought in allusions to the dry alley regularly every Sunday, and drew lessons from the man who always takes the heaviest cheese, and the man who can never finish his beer on time, and mixed up the skittles with the kings of Israel and Judah. And fancy the small boys being harried to the lamp-post and thrashed severely if they didn't play up. Of course, the goats wouldn't stand it for a moment, even if they were instructed in the valuable formative influence on the goat character of high-jumping and butting. Old Mr. Vaughan roared. He made much more noise than the loud schoolboy of his dreams. Come in, he said. I have some really old whiskey. Kiss him good night, Sylvia, he added as they stood in the hall. We are going to sit up talking till any hour you please. Ambrose blushed scarlet as the beautiful Sylvia bent forward and kissed his cheek as a matter of course. It was clear that he had discovered the earthly paradise. He bent low and took her hand and kissed her fingertips, and she smiled at him with kind eyes. The old man and he went to the study, where the servant had set the whiskey ready. All the old books were in their place, but Mr. Vaughan had utilized a vacant space to set up a large bookcase with his own special volumes. It was an extraordinary collection, the famous Ducange, the works of Duns Scotus, and several other of the schoolmen, collections of rhymed Latinity, some books on medieval costume, a great array of Graal romances, monastic records, one tall gradual, splendidly illuminated on parchment leaves, Histoire des Filles de Joie au Moyen Âge, and a manual of the tarot. These were a few of the oddities that caught Ambrose's eye as he glanced about him before sitting down. It is like a great wood, he said, as they poured out their drink, pointing to his cousin's bookcase. Everything is to be found in it, from the oak to the scarlet fungus, and one hears the bubbling of the wells, the dripping of cold springs, the sound of the wind, and the rustling of little furry beasts in the undergrowth. Yes, it is an amusing collection, isn't it? I find them all useful for the romance I am writing. Ambrose tried to hear more about this romance, but his cousin would say nothing. It was not till some days had passed that Mr. Vaughan trusted his cousin with the secret of the romance. He was writing it in a kind of faked low Latin, and though his scheme was not much more foolish than that one which William Morris wrote his romances in Old English of his own invention, yet Ambrose had much ado to contain himself. Indeed, the idea rather appealed to him. There was a fantastic unreasonableness about it that was after his own heart. And yet it was so funny that he went for a walk directly after he heard this great matter. He walked briskly, puckering his cheeks all the way, and when at last he was a mile or so from the Wherry, he lay down and rolled in the grass, roaring and shrieking and bellowing with laughter till he was quite faint. Old Mr. Vaughan had shown him a leaf of his manuscript, and he had seen a chapter title, Haga de Giardino, which meant the garden hedge. It was, somehow, more than he could bear. Yet, if he listened to the old man, his scheme seemed absolutely logical. It was quite impossible to resist the cogency of his arguments. You see, he said, in the first place, I, personally, regard the English language as a quite impossible medium of expression, for the present, that is. Of course there must come an end to the present corruption. Liberal and conservative politicians, Anglican bishops, dissenting preachers, wealthy manufacturers, and journalists will not be suffered to rule the land forever. When the politicians and manufacturers are hanged, when the bishops and the preachers are burnt, by the way, I should make the fire slower for the bishops. Then, perhaps, English may become fit once more for the use of a man of letters. The journalists, oh, I forgot, they will have to eat their own words, of course, the worst torture of all. But now, do you know that a man who doesn't split his infinitives or use like for as is regarded as a very affected person, a kind of euphemist? They say literature is meant for the people, and the people have no time for hair-splitting over words and sentences. This is a democratic age, you know, and the people, I suppose, must have darned hot stuff, or 40 million Englishmen will know the reason why. Exaggerating? Nothing of the kind. You can't have read the papers, or you wouldn't talk such nonsense. Exaggerating? Look what this ass says. This gigantic, gargantuan, super-imbecile jolthead. Look, I have cut him out. I should like to cut him up. Do you see that he says that Keats and Ruskin were so full of their subject that they had no time to consider themselves as literary craftsmen? Who is going to write English when slugs like that have crawled all over the language? Why, it's like finding a toad, a blindworm, 3 snails, and a dozen, woodlice in a meat pie, and then finishing it. Here he goes again. The unfailing instinct of the great public. Authors should make it their aim to preach to this great public. He pretends to think, this lunatic, that what he calls the great public have some voice and authority in literature, about as much of either as the passengers on a liner have over the navigation of the ship. No, it's quite out of the question for a self-respecting man to have anything to do with such a literary world as this. Therefore, my only course is to write my romance in Low Latin, a fine tongue, a most flexible medium, a synthesis of the ancient world and the modern, possessing the sonority and splendor of the old Latin, mingled with the life and movement of the new languages. It has never had journalism written in it, and it never will. Ambrose ventured to put a cautious question as to the public to which Mr. Vaughan hoped to appeal, and his cousin pointed out that he would speak to the learned over the whole world, since he would be using a language which was understood by everyone with the slightest pretensions to education. I shall be read by Frenchmen, Germans, Mexicans, Russians, Swedes, and citizens of Guatemala. I shall appeal to an expert audience from which the populace are entirely excluded. I shall restore the art of letters to its proper dignity as a great craft, a mystery. Oh, there are innumerable advantages in my plan. For example, I saw in a review the other day that it was a pity Mr. Thingamy, who wrote so well, should produce a book which could not possibly be put into the hands of a young girl. I shall escape all that. No one would ever dream of placing a Low Latin romance in the hands of a young girl, or of an old one either. He began to talk of the beauties of his medium, of the strange music which it gave so readily. It is like an old violin, he said. It is permeated with melody. It sounds and echoes with the enchanted song of the age when it came into being. It chants of crenellated walls, of great cathedral glories. It has the savours of Gascon wine, drunk in painted taverns. It smells of incense. It has seen the rich wonders of old cities. It knows the dimness of the cloister, the trumpets and the clamour of the tournament, the rapture of the hidden saints, the revelry of flowery festivals. And mark, it has never been tainted by the defilement of popularity, and it has never been the means by which the mob has uttered its foolishness and its wickedness. All that is of good in the people it has assimilated, and yet it has always worn the garments of the Latin life. It is a peasant, if you please, but a peasant who has received the sacerdotum, and is entitled to wear the vestments of the church. Nobody has ever been interviewed in Low Latin, and in it leading articles never will be written. And speaking of music, you see this song I have just written in the Phrygian mode. Look at these neumes. You observe the peculiar shape of the podactus and the biverga. I shall insist on an exact reproduction. It is most important. And Ambrose went out and hid himself in remote places, giving way to inextinguishable mirth. It might be all very true. It might be, as his cousin said, that the chosen medium was the exact equivalent in language to the Gothic in architecture, the marriage of the Latin genius to the Teutonic and Celtic. Yet it was all a farce in 5 acts, an elaborate and staged absurdity. There were many pleasant days and nights at the Wern. He went for long walks with his cousin Sylvia, revisiting many revered places of ancient pilgrimage. He looked up authorities for the old man, and one day delighted him by solemnly burning, in the face of the pig Walter Map, his cricket bat and flannels. The days passed in ceaseless sunshine. All the nights were laden with the odour of the dewy fields and the running brook, of the procession of leaves and flowers.